Hello, my name is Dr. Kurt Sander, and this is Music Theory Simplified. Most of our time together has been spent looking at harmony and melody as they occur in either a major or minor sonority. But music is so much more than major and minor. Composers started to understand this at the turn of the century, where the seemingly infinite resources of major and minor tonality were somehow feeling exhausted. So they began to look at other modes and scales that really were quite different from your traditional major and minor scale. Every scale has its own character, and when you change those intervallic relationships, it changes the melodic flavor of the music that you write. So today's lesson is going to look at scales and modes that are different from our traditional major and minor scales. But before we begin, let's start by defining exactly what a scale is.
We can think of a scale as a collection of pitches that provides an organizational intervallic pattern to a musical composition. Composers use pitches much in the way an artist might use colors in a palette. The character of a scale is based in part on the intervallic relationships between the notes being used. Here we can see an abstract pattern of whole and half-step relationships in the major and natural minor scale. And while we can call these scales, we can also refer to these as modes. So this leads to the question, what's the difference between a scale and a mode? It's a term that has its origins all the way back to ancient Greece. When we use the word mode, we're actually referring to melodic behaviors that help to identify the modal center of a particular collection of pitches. If we play only the white notes on a piano, we can create a number of different modes, but the only way that we tell the difference is how the melody behaves. So the process of identifying modes is not simply identifying notes or even intervallic patterns, but actually seeing how melodies behave. When people think of modes, they most often refer to the so-called church modes of medieval Europe. Among these are Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. Historically, these preceded what we call today a major or natural minor scale. We won't get into the history of the modes in this video. Rather, we're going to look at ways that we can identify the modes through certain idiomatic melodic characteristics. The easiest way to identify modes is to relate them to either the major or minor scales. There are some like the Dorian and Phrygian that have a minor sound, whereas others like Lydian and Mixolydian have a more major sound. This is because of the relationship between the first and third scale degrees. But before we look at these modes, let's look at the major and minor scales, because these are also considered modes. They even have their own special Greek names that we use when we refer to their modal characteristics. Let's begin with the natural minor scale. We can refer to this scale by its modal name, Aeolian. It can be clearly identified through certain melodic characteristics that favor the flat 6th to the 5th scale degree. It also has a whole step between the 7th and 8th scale degree. Here's what it sounds like. But what if, instead of playing an A flat, we played an A natural, making it a whole step between the 5th and 6th scale degree? By making this one small change, we've taken the Aeolian mode and turned it into the Dorian mode. Here's what it sounds like. This mode definitely has a folk quality to it that we associate sometimes with Celtic or medieval music. To identify it, listen for that raised 6th scale degree, and also listen for the natural 7th scale degree, which is a whole step between the modal center above it. Here's an example. But now let's go back to our natural minor scale with the half step between the 6th and 5th scale degrees. What if we took this scale and lowered the 2nd scale degree, creating a half step between the 1st and 2nd scale degrees? We would call this mode Phrygian. Phrygian has a very dark quality about it because of that lowered second scale degree. Here's what it sounds like. Modes are not simply for Gregorian chant. We find modes in all kinds of classical eras and also in video game music and film music. Here's a contemporary setting that uses the Phrygian mode. Note that half-step relationship between the first and second scale degrees that make this very much a melodic characteristic of Phrygian. Let's take a listen. Not all modes are minor in character. Some actually have a major sound to them, and we can associate them with the major scale. Here's the major scale. Note that its melodic characteristics favor the fourth to third half-step relationship and the leading tone 7 to 8 relationship. Here's what it sounds like. Just like the natural minor scale, the major scale also has a Greek modal name. We refer to this as the Ionian mode. But what if we took that fourth scale degree, which is so characteristic of the major scale, and we made it a raised fourth scale degree? We can refer to this as the Lydian mode. Here's what it sounds like. Many composers have capitalized on this dual half-step relationship between 7 and 8 and 4 and 5. It has a brightness, kind of a sunniness about it that we find in many film scores. Here's an excerpt that shows the Lydian mode at work. Notice how uplifting it sounds. Let's go back to the major scale, and instead of raising the fourth scale degree, let's lower the seventh scale degree. By taking away one of the chief characteristics of the major or Ionian mode, which is that leading tone to tonic, we've created a new mode with new melodic characteristics. We call this mode Mixolydian. Here's what it sounds like. Mixolydian can be found throughout folk music, but also can be found in contemporary pop and rock music. In music for film or video games, the Mixolydian has a kind of heroic effect because of that lowered seventh scale degree. Here's an example of Mixolydian. Note the extensive use of this lowered seventh scale degree, which is a defining melodic characteristic of the Mixolydian mode. The four modes that we looked at, the minor-based Dorian and Phrygian, and the major-based Lydian and Mixolydian, are the four modes used most by composers as alternatives to regular major and minor scales. But composers have often combined certain characteristics of two modes to create a new hybrid mode. One of these hybrid modes is the Lydian Mixolydian mode. In this hybrid mode, note how the sharp fourth scale degree of the Lydian mode is used in the beginning of the scale, and in the upper portion of the scale, the lowered seventh scale degree of the Mixolydian is used. Here's what it sounds like. The fun and unexpected twists and turns of this hybrid mode create a wealth of melodic possibilities that can be used in both classical and contemporary music. Here's a setting that uses this hybrid Lydian Mixolydian mode. In examining alternatives to the major and minor scale, let's start with the pentatonic scale. Music is not the universal language that some people believe it to be, but if there is one element that is universally understood in cultures throughout the world, it's the pentatonic scale. Many theorists distinguish between major and minor forms of this scale. The major, that emphasizes the major third, sounds like this. And the minor pentatonic, which emphasizes the minor third, and sounds like this. But in truth, when we listen to a pentatonic scale, we tend to hear both major and minor simultaneously. Here's an example of music written with a pentatonic scale. Note how the major and minor triads inherent in this scale give it a sense of being in both major and minor at the same time. The complete lack of half steps also gives it a peaceful quality. Composers use new scales to create different effects. For example, the whole tone scale is made up entirely of major seconds. This scale is completely symmetrical, and because it has no half steps, it has the sense of not really being grounded to any one tonal center. The lack of any half-step motion gives us the sense that we have no gravitational pull to any one note, almost as if we're floating in space without gravity. Here it is in a musical passage. You've probably heard something like this before when a character enters into a dream sequence. Note that you don't hear a tonal or modal center with this scale. And in fact, when you're writing a whole tone scale, you really only have the choice of one of two. A scale that begins with C and moves by whole step all the way up, which we call whole tone 0, 0 referring to the note C, or a whole tone scale that begins on C sharp and has whole steps all the way up. This scale we refer to as whole tone 1, because 1 refers to C sharp in music theory. There are so many other scales that we could talk about, but we just have time for one more, and this is the octatonic scale. The octatonic scale is simply a pattern of alternating whole and half steps. And just like the whole tone scale, there is a limited number of forms that this scale can take. There are only 3 possible forms of octatonic scale, and just like with the whole tone scale, we will use numbers to represent the first and second pitches. For example, an octatonic scale starting on C and moving by half step to C sharp will be called octatonic 0-1, 0 standing for C and 1 standing for D flat or C sharp. An octatonic scale beginning on C and starting with a whole step would be octatonic 0-2, 2 standing for the note D. And lastly, an octatonic scale starting on the note C sharp and moving by half step is octatonic 1, 2. Here is what the scale sounds like. The scale was popular with composers in the 20th century, but we can find contemporary applications of this scale. Here's a musical passage written in Octatonic 01. Note that it sounds different from any of the other scales or modes that we've listened to thus far.
So you can see there are so many different musical possibilities that can come about if you just look beyond traditional major and minor. And we've really only scratched the surface of all the possible scales and modes that are out there. And if you really want to get to know these modes and scales, open your ears to these things that are happening in the concert hall, in film music, in commercial and popular music. Because when you start to listen differently and listen for melodic character, you start to hear these modes, these new scales, and all the different musical possibilities that can come about when you use them. And of course, our time together is never fully enough to explore the world of modes and scales, but hopefully it's enough to get you curious. For now, this is Dr. Sander reminding you always to keep it simple.